Hi, everyone. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm calling in from Beirut. I'm the executive director of Afikra. Thank you so much for joining today. Our special guest is Hala Alyan, who is the author of Salt Houses. Hala is the author of the novel Salt Houses, winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Arab American Book Award and a finalist for the Chautauqua Prize, as well as a newly released novel, The Arsonist City, and 4 award-winning collections of poetry, most recently, The 29th Year. Her work has been published by The New Yorker, the Academy of American Poets, Lit Hub, the New York Times Book Review, and Guernica. Hala was born in Illinois and grew up in Kuwait, Oklahoma, Texas, Maine, and Lebanon. She earned a BA from the American University of Beirut, an MA from Columbia University, while completing her doctorate in clinical psychology from Rutgers University. She specialized in trauma and addiction work with various populations. Hala now lives in Brooklyn with her husband, where she works as a clinical psychologist. Hala, welcome to Afikra Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is fun. You are one of a few people we've interviewed who is a longtime member of Afikra and has sort of been coming to events and been a part of the community for a long time. So I'm really excited that we get a chance to sort of dive into your work.
Me too. This is so exciting to be part of this, and I've been looking forward to this for the last few weeks.
Yeah, it's exciting. So I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Your childhood, as I just alluded to, sort of on the road. You lived in a bunch of different places. At what point in your childhood did you think to yourself, I really like to write. This is a special exercise. This is a place where I can sort of find myself while the backgrounds behind me keep on changing.
I think, so I learned English when we moved so we were in Kuwait and then the Saddam invasion happened, and I had just turned 4. And we moved, we moved around for a few months. We were in Syria. We were kind of figuring out what we were going to do. And then by the time I started kindergarten, we were in Dallas. We were in Texas. And I honestly think I started writing as I started learning English. Like I remember having these little silly stories in kindergarten and 1st grade and 2nd grade. And then I would write these poems that were terrible, like 3rd and 4th and 5th grade. So I've always written, but I think actually the entry point was reading. So as soon as I learned how to read, I was like, oh, there's an escapism in this. And there's a way in which you can kind of engage with different worlds and pretend to be different people and pretend to exist in different timelines in a way that I think, I'm not going to judge how healthy of a coping mechanism it was. It was a coping mechanism to deal with the fact that, like you're saying, the background and the physical spaces that I was in were constantly changing. And even the circumstances of my family, we went from being, I think, relatively middle class in Kuwait to kind of all the money was gone and sort of starting all over again in the States. And there was a bit of an emotional whiplash, I think, that went from being in a pretty relatively stable, steady life in Kuwait, where all my mom's siblings, my mom and dad's siblings were there, all my aunts and uncles, my grandparents. I don't obviously remember being 4 very well, but I imagine it must have been a little bit of a shock to go from that to a completely different, relatively isolated, relatively insular life in the States.
So I have a question about you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about, you mentioned your kind of bad childhood poetry.
Yes.
So when did you start to take that stuff a little more seriously?
So one of the things, I was actually just talking about this with someone, one of the things that happened was that in elementary school and in middle school, I got really reinforced for writing. And it was just sort of one of those things where there was an intersection of interest and then I think a little capacity to a certain extent where I would always get feedback on essays or papers or stories or whatever I did, that the teachers being this was really good, this was really, so I got a lot of reinforcement on my reading skill level and my writing skill level. So throughout school, I think I did it more to be the good girl and to get the straight A's. And then I remember when I started AUB, I started writing poetry more for pleasure and more for enjoyment. And then when I moved to New York, I became introduced in a little bit more of the spoken word community and open mics and just kind of got a little bit more of a community around writing and met more people that were actually like very much taking it seriously and had more of a model that I didn't really have in Beirut. I think the scene was probably there. I just wasn't interacting with it. But in New York, it was just more accessible, right? Like there's just more cafes, there's more spaces for things like that. And the scene has just been around for longer. And so I think getting more of a model of people that were like taking this very seriously helped. So I would say like early 20s, like 23, 24, I started being like, okay, I want to come up with like a writing practice. I want to try to do this every day, et cetera.
It's funny, you said at some point, you started doing it for enjoyment. That's not the word that sort of strikes me when I read your work, right? It doesn't strike me that it's an enjoyable experience for you. Is it?
It is. No, it totally is. I mean, I think it's there's a lot of subject, like the subject matter, I think is kind of dark at times and intense or heavy or whatever, but the process of writing, the process of like getting in the flow and kind of trying to create a world or enter a world or create characters and be surprised by what the characters are doing and just be fully immersed in a completely different reality is one of the most amazing, like it's like magic. It's one of the most like magical things I have access to in my life. Even though the subject matter, I hear what you're saying, like the subject matter is sort of like, it's heavy and it's not always like the funnest, but the process of making it, I also think the process of making it is really cathartic, which I think helps a lot.
Yeah, that makes sense. So on the screen here, there are 6 images, 4 collections of poetry and 2 novels. Starting in 2012 is the first sort of collection of poetry. I want to talk about Atrium for a second. Was that conceived from the jump as a collection of poetry, or were you just writing poems and performing them and then thought, maybe I can publish this? Like, walk me through the process there a little bit.
I mean, it was actually really serendipitous. And I often wonder what would have happened if that first book hadn't gotten published the way that it did, because it was relatively, I think it was 24 or 25, I was relatively young. And the way that it ended up planning out was that I was doing this open mic series at a cafe, which RIP is closed since then, but it's called Cornelia Street Cafe in New York. And I like was obsessed with it. Oh, so wonderful. And they had this Friday night open mic that was run by Pete and Kat, who had these 2 people that had a very small press called 3 Rooms Press. And they really took me in and would just like encourage me to come back week after week and do the open mic, and then like featured me, which was the most like glamorous thing that had ever happened to me, where you like get to read for 12 minutes and invite people and stuff. And about a year after going to the place pretty regularly, they took me aside and said, look, we are wanting to publish another collection. I think we published like 2 collections. And the reason it's called 3 Rooms Press is because literally they do it from their 1-bedroom apartment, which has 3 rooms, like that's it. And they were just like, do you have a bunch of poems that could conceivably be a collection? So I was not writing towards anything being published collectively. These poems ended up being kind of amassing poems that I had written in Beirut, and then poems in my first couple of years of New York, and then writing new ones after like they brought the idea to the table. So it was much more hodgepodge than like the rest of the collections. So
it's interesting. Do you still write, at least, we'll talk about poetry a little longer, then move on to the novels. When you approach this stuff, do you still think of it as an oral tradition? Are you writing poetry to be read and to be performed specifically, or do you sort of think of it on the page? And is it your favorite poetry on the page, or do you think of it as a spoken word medium still?
It's a good question. I think for me at this point, I tend to write to like if I know I'm going to be performing. Like, for example, if I'm invited to like feature at a spoken word event or something like that, I have poems that I have written that are specifically for being performed and specifically more for stage. Then I have a bunch of poems that are obviously for the page that I have like tweaked or adjusted or worked with the musicality to make them perform a little bit easier. I would say something interesting has been happening the last couple of years where the stuff that I'm writing seems to be working for both. Like I'm not thinking about the dichotomy anymore. I'm just sort of writing pieces and then finding that I have internalized maybe some of the like lyricism or like cadence that you need for the stage into the poems anyway, even when they're just written, when I'm thinking they're just written to be read on the page. And in terms of what I like to take in, it really depends on my mood. I think spoken word is wonderful, and I think it's an amazing medium. I think it really speaks to the times when I'm like looking to kind of like get pumped up, or like, it's like it feels more energetic. Whereas like if I, sitting with a collection of poetry, for me it's more like an immersive, like quieter experience.
Yeah. Okay. There's going to be tons of questions about poetry in the chat, so I want to talk a little bit about Salt Houses, your first novel. Before we sort of talk about the themes, how long had you been thinking about this? Because like the old adage about like your first novel is like takes you your whole life to write. Had you been thinking about this when you were a kid? There are obvious sort of biographical parallels. Is this something that you had sort of been tossing around for a decade?
Not consciously, but I think it's one of those things where I remember hearing someone say once, like, your first novel is the book you've been writing your entire life up until that point. And I think there's definitely some truth to that, where like, I think I had been amassing, insights and details without being aware that I was doing it up until I started like working on the project. But consciously, it started just as a short story. It started as a short story of a young man in Nablus before 67. And then from there, I was like, oh, I really want to write this family out. Now I'm really curious about his sister. I'm curious about his mom. I wonder what happens after 67 to them. And it's sort of, which is why the book feels very like almost episodic. Like you're kind of like going in and out of perspectives per chapter. So I think on some level, definitely I've been writing it my whole life, but then consciously it was more like when I started having to do research and things like that, it was more when I had actually started working on projects.
I was reading one of the reviews, which I'll read now. It says, lyrical and heartbreaking, Salt Houses is a remarkable debut novel that challenges and humanizes an age-old conflict we might think we understand. Age-old conflict we might think we understand, one that asks us to confront the most devastating of all truths: you can't go home again. So, as somebody who lives in Beirut, this is like deeply saddening to read something like that. But as you are writing that original short story, are you basically creating a fictionalized version of your family history? Is it like therapeutic in that way that you're like, what did this look like? What did that experience look like for some sort of imagined version of your ancestors, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not basing it on people in my family, but basing it kind of like you were saying on the migration or the movement or sort of the general, like, what was Kuwait like in the 70s? I mean, of course, in trying to answer that or in writing about Kuwait in the 70s, I am thinking about my father being there in the 70s. So there's definitely an element of like kind of conjuring these worlds by default means thinking about the people that I know that lived in those places and in those times. There wasn't the entry point necessarily of like, this is like, I'm going to base this person on like a grandparent, I'm going to base this person on my mom or something like that. It wasn't quite as concrete as that, but definitely just the general, I don't know, like the history, the atmosphere, the overall like displacement motion, like very much feels very, I mean, it's not just borrowed, it's literally what happened. Like it's, the idea of being displaced multiple times over is, I mean, that's a story, that's a narrative that I've been interested in my whole life. I didn't just pluck that from the sky. I've been interested in it because I've lived it and my parents have lived it and my grandparents have lived it. So in that sense, it's definitely like autobiographical.
Was the conception from the jump to have it be this like multi-generational idea, or how did that sort of unfold for you?
No, I mean, I think, like I was saying, it's from the jump, it was a short story. And then it was sort of like, maybe I'll write another short story about this sister. And then I'm going to write another short story about this, whatever. It took me, I didn't use the word novel to describe it until I started looking for agents, like for the, however, 2-3 years that I was working on it. And if someone was like, what are you writing? I'd be like, oh, just this longer project. I'm working on this longer. And it was like 600 pages. I'm like, this longer project. Like, it just like, I think the word novel really freaked me out. And I just didn't know how to like tie in what felt like really discordant narratives, which was a big part of the editing process. So no, I mean, I definitely, if I had sat down that first day and said, I'm going to try to write like a intergenerational story that spans, 70 years and talks about Palace, I would have never written another word because I would have been so immobilized by terror at the prospect of that task. So it had to be really like piecemeal.
Okay. So here's a question for you.
Yeah.
Insofar as like when you think about poetry, or like your DNA when it comes to poetry is like based off the spoken word, did you use that in writing? Like, does this sound good saying it? Would you be reading chapters aloud saying, do I even like performing this? Because it seems like a decidedly different medium, right?
Totally. Yeah. No. So I've never like, unless I am doing something specifically to be performed, I'm not usually reading it aloud as I'm writing it. But I think there are things that sneak in, whether or not you're conscious of it. Like, I think and that's what I was saying with like realizing more recent poetry, even if I'm writing for the page, I'm noticing that like there's more lyricism or musicality. I think there's a way in which you train your brain to like, it's the same thing, honestly, I write really flowery, really wordy, really descriptive first drafts where there's like too many adjectives, too many adverbs. That's definitely like a poet's, like it's an occupational hazard of being a poet, that like when I write fiction, it tends to be very poetic, sometimes overly so, and then has to be like streamlined and cleaned up a little bit. So I definitely think part of it is just these little like, yeah, these kind of like language writing tics that I have.
Yeah. So this might sound like a stupid question, but what did you learn in the process of writing it? Because it's 70 years, right? So you didn't walk in with the knowledge that you must have walked out with. What did you learn? What surprised you?
Everything. I mean, I think this is true for both books. Like I learned so much more about the history than I knew. I learned really random details about like what was popular in different cities at different times, because I was trying to create worlds that felt authentic, not just for a reader in their 20s now, but if somebody older who had actually lived in those places would be able to read it and say, yeah, that resonates. I think I also just like, I wrote it while I was doing my dissertation and doing my last couple of years of training in the doctoral program. And so I think I learned a lot too about like asking questions of characters and their motivations and their desires, and I mean, essentially, I learned how to write a novel, which I think is what your first novel is, right? So it's like learning how to do the thing. And I think a big part of it for me had to do with learning how to like ask the right questions of the people that you're writing about and of the times that you're writing about. And that has then made, in my experience, like writing the second novel much quicker, it wasn't always easy, it wasn't like a breeze, but much easier than the first one, because I had walked away with a skill set that I didn't have before I started working on Saw Houses.
Do you feel like, you're talking about your dissertation, do you feel like your educational training offers guidance to like understand, to sort of deconstruct characters' motivations and characters' incentives and how they might react to trauma? Like,
yeah,
are there two different Halas? Like, is there sort of one who has that hat on and one who has a different hat on, or are you thinking through the same sort of intellectual challenges and unpacking both of them?
I think
regardless of what time of the day?
I think it's very similar. I don't feel like, oh, I got to be a psychologist now, or oh, I have to be a writer now. I think the two worlds have been integrated fully in my mind, and I'm asking very similar questions in both. So if a client or patient comes in, I mean, again, there's a similar, like, you're taking fragments and you're trying to make a cohesive whole. So like in therapy, like someone comes in and they're telling you, random snapshots of their life and symptoms and the things that they're worried about or the things that they're trying to work on or whatever. And then you're trying to kind of make a cohesive picture out of that, right? Like you're trying to help them integrate those like fragmented experiences into their lives. It's very similar to writing. I mean, when I sit down to write a novel or to work on a story, whatever, I have like a dream that I had that was inspiring, or I have like an image of something, or I have a photograph that was interesting, right? There was a conversation I overheard a few years ago and I like wrote something down because there was a snippet of it I wanted to like try to integrate it. Like all of that is, you're just starting with pieces and then you're trying to find a way to make something that feels cohesive from it. And in both, again, like the training, I think taught me to ask questions of clients and to ask questions in the therapeutic process that has been super useful in trying to create like realistic characters.
Yeah. Do you feel like writing this was an emotional experience for you?
Yeah,
Because I feel like I can talk to you about it now. Maybe it's because you've done it like dozens of interviews about it. But I feel like it doesn't seem, and maybe this is silly on my part, it doesn't seem like it's like a heavy topic now, but like going through the process of writing it, was it heavy where you're like, oh my God, shit.
Yes.
I can't get through this right now. This is too heavy for me.
It was totally heavy. I think part of it is also Saw Houses came out in 2017. So anytime a book comes out, you count backwards like 2 years when it was handed in, right? So like it's like it was finished and handed into the publishers in 2015 or like maybe early 2016. So it had been written. So all of this is to say it was written a while ago, actually. Like it was written like, I don't even know what year we're in anymore, like 8 years ago, 9 years ago, like it's been a while. So I think that's part of maybe there's a little bit of distance from the project. But when I really get in touch with like what it was like to write it, it was very emotional. It was very like, there were a lot of times when I got like, I would like be crying. Well, first of all, it's emotional in the sense of you're like, I hate this. This is terrible. I'm a terrible writer. I'm never going to be able to do this. So it's emotional in the sense of like imposter syndrome and feeling like you're not going to be able to do the project, which I think I've come to terms with as just part of the creative process. And then it's emotional in the sense of like these topics are really, I mean, they're really loaded, and to write about these places meant to evoke loss. So if you're going to write about Palestine, you in the 60s or in the 50s or in the 40s, you're going to write about everything that comes after, which is really heartbreaking. So I think there's something implied in these subject matters and these locations that's also really kind of devastating.
Insofar as this is like semi-biographical, right? Not directly. Was it emotional for your family? Were you sending them drafts, or were you like, just wait till it comes out? Are they like, do you have a mother like my mother who would be like, this is not what happened? And I'd be like, this is not about you. And it's like, no. Like,
so yes, for sure. I mean, like definitely I have an aunt who's always like, I'm sad. And I'm like, hey, these are not people. These are characters. You're not anybody. So like, there's definitely kind of like, this is, me, I'm this character. So I think, especially with like a multi-generational family, like I do think there's a little bit of people hunting for who they are based on the character. So there's some of that. I did not give drafts in. When I had the full thing done, and by done, there were still edits to do, but I had like a proper finished thing. I gave it to my brother. My brother was one of the first readers. And then I think I guess my dad must have read like an advanced copy. So it was by that point it had found a publisher. We'd done some edits, but it wasn't like the full published thing. And then my mom and everyone else just read it when it came out, I wasn't like, you can't read it, but I was like, you might as well wait. And then the same thing with the second one. It was like, I gave it to my brother. This time I gave it to my brother, my dad, and like there was a friend of mine, and I gave them like sort of, I just wanted their eyes on it and I wanted their opinions. So I think it kind of depends on the family member.
Makes sense. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Arsonist City, and then we can get to some of the poetry, but I think I actually want to transition into the Q&A faster because we have like 10 questions in the Q&A already.
Yeah.
So walk me through when you first started thinking about the plot of the Arsonist City and why a novel was the medium you chose for it.
So the Arsonist City started as, this sounds ridiculous, it was a dream that I had when I was in late 2016, early 2017, I can't remember. But essentially, Saw Houses was virtually done. There were still some edits that were being done, but it was like almost ready to be put in the world. And I had this really intense dream about a woman like I dreamt the plot, which sometimes happens to me. I'm a vivid dreamer, and I just dreamt kind of like the plot of this like woman in Syria who wanted to move to Hollywood and become an actor, and then like moved to California, and it didn't work out, and was really disappointed in her life. And it was just, I woke up and was like, who is this woman? What happened? And like I just like word vomited on my computer like all these like pages, everything that I could remember, and I sent it to my brother. And he was like, I don't even know what this is. This is like the summary of something. What is this? And I was like, I don't know. It's this dream I had. So I kept that in mind for the following, I would say about a year. So until Saw Houses came out and was in the world, I was working on shorter fiction. It felt too overwhelming to try to take on a bigger project. So I kind of would keep coming back to the woman, and I was like, maybe I'd turn that into a short story, but it felt like it wanted to be like a bigger thing. Meanwhile, I had also been working on this short story that was turning into a novella about sort of like the expat culture in Beirut. So modern day Beirut, and expats not just meaning ajanib, but also meaning like Arab that are not Lebanese, that are pretty Americanized, that were kind of gathering sort of based on a lot of my AUD experience. And then when it came time to start, when I finally finished with Salt Houses, I launched it, I felt good. And I sat down with my editor and was like, there are these two ideas. I feel like either could be longer. And she was like, I wonder if there's a way to marry them. And then I just like spent a couple of weeks and was thinking about it. And I was like, oh, actually the woman could be the mother of somebody that ends up in Beirut. And that from there, kind of like the idea. I mean, that's kind of what's really fun about brainstorming, which I'm sure you know, and anybody's creative knows. It's like, you can start with something and then you're like, oh, but also this other thing. And maybe there's another, it's like, oh, there's a son and that son is jealous of the sister. And then this person's, and then just kind of like snowballed from there.
So if I think about that dream, right, and that woman in that dream, like, how much of the sort of architecture of that person's personality is really formed when you wake up, right? So you wake up, you like jot stuff on your thing. Are you thinking about her incentives and her motivations, or are you thinking just like plot point? I mean, you're not thinking at all. You're remembering a dream. Does your dream feature those motivations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like, it's a little silly. I mean, it feels a little bit weird to talk about it because it does feel like it just sort of plopped in my lap, and I'm very grateful for it. Like I essentially dreamt the character Mesna, who is one of the core characters of the book. I didn't dream what happens with her kids or her dad or her husband or any of that, but like the sort of core thing of this woman who is deeply motivated to leave Syria, who has these desires, who has these wants, who has these disappointments. Like it felt like it arrived kind of fully formed, which is, again, not like the most common experience. I don't want to pretend I'm just constantly dreaming up stories.
Yeah, if you are, please like cut me in on the next one.
But I know, yeah, I'd be doing bigger things with
it. Okay, so I want to get to the questions in the chat, but just like functionally and like from a process wise, because you mentioned your writing process, how many, I have two questions actually. One is how many projects are you working on at the same time? Like for me, I have to be working on a couple different things at the same time because I have to like turn to the other side of the pillow, right? I need like a different, I need to like let something go. But some people are very, very focused. They want to like only eat, breathe, and sleep one project. How do you sort of?
I'm like you. I need palate cleansers and I need like things to be firing on all cylinders, but I can't do more than one thing in one genre. Meaning I couldn't work on two novels at once. I actually released like the most I can do is a short story in a novel, but even that, frankly, I can't do. So usually I have something fiction and I have something poetic, and then sometimes some nonfiction or an essay or something that's more like work related that I have to do, and then kind of like switching back and forth between them. And I feel very, very fortunate that I write and I'm interested in writing in different genres because they do end up being palate cleansers. So if I'm stuck on a novel or I'm stuck on a fiction project, I can do poetry, and poetry feels a little bit more like liberated and expansive, and I can breathe more, and then I can like come back to the story with fresh eyes. So definitely always like, yeah, more than one project.
Okay. This is my last question before we go into the other stuff.
Yeah.
What do you like? And I am trying to say that in a way that's basically, what do you consume, right? So I think largely, if you think about creative folks, they're usually a sort of a accumulation of their own references, right? They're accumulation of the stuff that they're eating, and then they're pushing that stuff out, right? So what have you consumed over the course of the last 20 years when you have read as much as you've read? Who are you referencing, and who would we maybe be surprised that you're referencing?
So I've been made fun of by my family this entire past week because during the launch, the guy was like, what were you like watching while you were writing The Arsonist City? And the only thing I could think of was that I rewatched How I Met Your Mother. And it was like, they were just like, you sounded like an idiot. I was like, it was true. So yeah, so there's stuff like that. Like I've like rewatched How I Met Your Mother a million times. And then like in terms of authors, you know, I love like, it's like poetry by Etel Adnan. or Ada Limon, I love Jhumpa Lahiri. Like, I think in terms of like who has influenced me, like it's like Jhumpa Lahiri, Amy Tan, those are kind of like the greats that come to mind. And then when I got turned on to more Arab writers, like Randa Jarrar has been, like is someone that like I really enjoyed reading. Oh my God, I forgot his last name. Zain I don't want to butcher his name. He just had a book come out, The 30 something of night. 30 Names of Night, or The 30 something of night. Like I think it's like more recently I read Zain Arafat. I don't know if you read Zain Arafat.
Yeah, so Randa Jarrar and Zain Arafat were both on the program as well.
Yeah, so You Exist Too Much was a
so good.
wonderful book.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been more modern-y, like Marwa Hilal's poetry over the last few years, things like that. But the like kind of like the OGs were like, yeah, it's like Amy Tan, Jhumpa Lahiri. I'm trying to think of like who else. Darwish, like I would read Darwish translated, sadly, because my Arabic Fusha sucks, but like I started with that pretty young. Like I was like 11, 12. My dad would be like, you would love this, read this. Like I think there's been the people that I have liked and been drawn to are people that write about these like intergenerational, kind of have these sweeping novels, things like that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We're going to move into a quick Q&A and then open up to the chat. Okay, what are you reading or watching right now?
So I just read The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and we just finished WandaVision, which was very weird and very good.
Yeah. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
My grandma, because I feel like she had secrets, not bad ones, but I'm always like, what did she do when she wasn't just like forcing us to have third helpings of her food? Like, what was she doing during her days when nobody was there?
When she was a grandmother, or you're like imagining what did she do in her 20s?
Honestly, even as a like, I don't know. I'm not sure about the age, but I think even when she was a grandma, like what was she doing because I think there was a little bit of performativeness, not in a bad way, but I think there was kind of like the theta role, like that had to be done. And I'm curious, like when no one was there, what did she do to occupy herself? What was she thinking about? Like, did she sing to herself? I don't know. I have a lot of those questions.
Cool. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
That it's not political because it's about families.
There's been a lot
particularly in the US, there was a lot of like in the reviews, which were wonderful, and I'm very grateful for them, but there was a lot of like, this transcends politics. This isn't the story of Palestine or politics. This is the story of a family. And I was like, I think there's a little bit of neutralizing that you're doing to be able to consume this.
Yeah, the P in Palestine stands for politics, right?
Exactly.
Okay, whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
I think I would say Jhumpa Lahiri. I think when I think about like the interpreter of maladies, the lowlands, like the person who I first read her work in my late teens, and then she would put out something new every few years. And so she really carried me through like my 20s. So yeah, I would say Jhumpa Lahiri.
Okay, great. So we are going to start with our first question, which comes from Michael. I think that's how you say the name.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
it's actually Michal.
Michal.
Yeah, that's okay. And it's a question about salt houses, which I actually assigned for a course that I'm teaching with another instructor who's also on here, Naveen Abraham. And we're actually teaching a course on food cultures in the Middle East. So we assigned the novel, but I'm asking about food. Since course is using food to talk about identity and national identity. And so we were wondering if you intended to make food play a role for the main characters when they were at home or felt more settled somewhere, as opposed to after they went into exile or felt lost or unsettled in a new place.
So first of all, thank you for having my book be part of your course. That's a great question. And it's funny, I've been asked similar things about food. It's never been conscious. So I think there's definitely something that's happening on my end of associating, like talking about food and cooking and preparation and sitting and sharing meals. That is clearly something that's important to me and in my family, and something that I've garnered comfort from, because what's been pointed out to me, similar to your question, is that I use it as a way to comfort the characters a lot, or a way for the characters to still feel connected to, like, their heritage or their families or places or whatever. It's never been conscious it was something, I think I kind of like gave myself away. I never realized that it was something that played such a factor until it was pointed out to me afterwards.
Cool. Great. Naveen, you're up next.
Thank you. I am Michal's co-instructor in the course that she just mentioned. We have been talking a lot about your novel. I'm so excited to meet you today. So thank you for taking our questions.
Of course.
And congratulations. Yeah, Salt Houses is amazing. So you kind of addressed my question, but if you have anything to add, and my question is about, did Salt Houses help you? You said you were writing your PhD thesis while finishing it. So in what ways maybe Salt Houses helped you finish it? When you mentioned something about motivations in the characters, the desires, perhaps if you can talk about maybe the displacement stage. Was there any stage that was more challenging than other?
Yeah, so I definitely think, so first of all, thank you. I think I'll answer the last question first. So the writing about like you're exactly what you said, writing about the displacements and writing about the moments, right? Actually, for me, the hardest things to write about were the moments right before I knew a displacement was coming. The characters didn't know it was coming, but I knew it was happening, so like before the invasion, before 67, writing the family relatively stable, relatively happy, having kind of just their like family dramas, and then knowing something was coming up was actually really quite emotional, which is silly because these aren't real people, but like there was something in the fact that I knew what was coming their way that they didn't know yet. That was actually really hard. So I would say definitely those big pivotal moments where the characters had to find new places to live was really hard. And in terms of, I love the question about the dissertation. It actually really helped me a lot finish the dissertation in that I used it, it's like carrot and stick. Like I would earn 30 minutes of writing, working on the fiction if I did 2 hours of working on the dissertation. So I would like motivate myself to get through a day of working on dissertation by being like, you get to write fiction at the end of it. Like it was like kind of like the treat or the ice cream. And in that way, tricked myself into writing both, essentially.
Great. Thanks. Sama, you're up next.
Hi, thank you so much, Hala. I'm trying to pursue a path in clinical psychology, so I'm actually interested in the reverse of the last question. So how has your practice, or to what extent has your clinical practice influenced / inspired your writing?
So I think that the clinical work has helped with the writing in that it helps me, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, it helps me ask the right questions of the characters. So one of the things that clinical training does, and you'll discover this if you're about to do it, like it teaches you what questions to ask of your clients, and then it also teaches you what to be paying attention to. So I think there's something in the like learning how to hone your attention and know where to be looking for, or know what to be looking for and in what ways, that I think helped me ask realistic questions of my characters. So for example, my characters often are doing things that are not in their interest, right? Like humans, like most of us, right? So they're often making dubious decisions or getting caught in like some cycles that don't serve them, which is very similar to most of us and similar to a lot of, the people that I work with, to myself, to family, whatever. And so I think there's a lot in clinical training that's helped me understand what it is that makes a person get caught in those cycles. And therefore I can work backwards in writing or developing a character to make sure that it actually feels realistic, as opposed to somebody reading something and being like, well, why is this person doing this? It's just annoying. But if you understand their context, you can have empathy for them.
Great question. Renee, you're up next.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I was curious a little bit about how cultural psychology and different cultural paradigms factor into both your clinical practice and then also the way you address trauma in your novels, especially because you were trained at a US university with a very specific Euro-American understanding of trauma and mental health. So how do you kind of navigate kind of two different cultural paradigms for trauma and health?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, essentially what I have found to be true is that you kind of get your training and then you have to forget a lot of it if you're not working with the population that you were being trained specifically to work for, which is, the field of psychology is relatively new. It's not that old. And most of the time that it's been around, it's been created, written, and thought about, and for white, Western, honestly, relatively affluent or middle-class populations. And so there's a lot, frankly, that just doesn't translate. So for me, a lot of the kind of like pen on book things that I was like studying and learning and whatever, I honestly don't feel like it has been applicable in my clinical practice. What had helped a lot was then doing a lot of training at sites that work, like Program for Survivors, like working with survivors of torture, working in forensic settings, working in places that served immigrant communities. I think that helped because I would then have models in my clinical supervisors and in the staff and in the people that had been working for a different way to do it. For example, people like accepting gifts or like, you know, self-disclosing, revealing things of themselves when they were having a hard time to their clients, not in a burdening way, but in a like, we're all human, we're all in this together, and I'm no better than you. And yes, there is an implicit hierarchy in this relationship, but I'm here to try to like have the conversation about that and to make this as collaborative as possible. So I think a lot of it came from actually the clinical staff that I worked with. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a dichotomy that exists. One of the nice things about being licensed and out in the world is that you then can kind of create your own modality, as long, I mean, obviously it's ethical, but like you can create your own way of working with people.
Great question.
Yeah.
Shagufta, I think I said that correctly. You're up next. I'm going to read your question because we can't hear you. Let me pull it up. Okay. I've been puzzling over the title of the Arsonist city and would love to hear more about what the title refers to and how you chose it.
Okay, great. So I, with Salt Houses, had a placeholder title for the entire time that I was writing it. And then trying to think of a title once I found a publisher was a very unpleasant process. So I felt really strongly about locking something in before I even started. Well, I kind of started writing, but like from the beginning. And for me, I wanted, so fire features prominently in the story, in that fire has historically been used as a means of protest, not just in Lebanon, but everywhere. Like it's one of the ways that people express protest. So the fire in the sense of fire as used by that. And then also there's like mild acts of arson throughout the story. So I was thinking of it both in terms of the fires that we set intentionally and unintentionally within our lives, and then sort of in larger context.
You, I'm the type of person that if I don't know the title of something, I don't know what it is. Are you that, like, did the working title of Salt Houses at least feel like a title that worked?
I mean, you're going to, the working title of Salt Houses was The Carnival Sky, which like really doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. So okay. Yeah, not so much.
Okay, great. All right, Andrea, you're up next.
Hi, thank you so much, Hala. I really adore your writing, so I'm so glad to be meeting you and speaking with you. I feel like a lot of people have been asking about your experience with clinical psychology and that process of writing, so I'll kind of move to the second part of my question. How did you carve out space for your creative side while balancing the doctoral program and just the demands of your profession? I'm asking as someone who is in a clinical psych PhD program and just struggling, truly struggling to make space for my creative side. And
yeah.
So yeah, just like knowing you're out there and writing and that you did this during your doc program is very inspiring to me, and I don't know how to do it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and I could not resonate more. I think it's one of those things that feels impossible until you start to do it. So I personally have a practice of 30 minutes a day. That's it. I don't write more, I don't write less. If I'm on a writing residency or I have a ton of time, sometimes I'll write more, but I'm actually pretty regimented about not doing more than that. Because if I try to tell myself I have to do an hour or two, I will put it off all day and then I won't do it. 30 minutes is like manageable. I think most people can carve out 20 or 30 minutes in their day to do something creative. The question is, are you going to have the energy for it, the motivation, the et cetera? So I think of it less as do it because you feel like it and more as do it to build a habit. Because our brains are so dumb. And if you do anything every single day for a few weeks, by the end of those few weeks, the next morning you'll wake up and your mind will be like, hey, we have to do that thing. That's what we do now. So I think that it really is like, be uncomfortable for a few weeks, carve out a certain, and even if it's 5 minutes, whatever, commit to a certain thing, force yourself to do it for a few weeks. And I promise you, your system will automatically be like, this is just what we do now. It's very unglamorous, to be honest with you.
Hala, you just reminded me of a quote I heard Jerry Seinfeld say in an interview when somebody was asking him, oh, you're so regimented, you're so prolific, you produce so much work. And he said that basically the exact same thing. And he said, our brains are dumb, our minds are wise.
Totally.
And so he was like, all of us have dumb brains. Just train the dumb brain and your wise mind will emerge.
Will step in. And it's a really habit formation. It's just like our days are full of habits that are good and bad, just like build a new habit.
Yep. Okay, we are going to skip Hanin because she's not on the call. And Celine, you're up next. Let me unmute you.
Thank you for just providing so much insight into your writing process, and you're so down to earth. It's lovely hearing you. I want to I combine two questions that I asked later on. I want to know more about how you would describe your relationship with writing. Is it your work, or is it more metaphysical and spiritual, or do you just write for yourself and then like publish? Like, how do you describe it?
That's a great, amazing question. I don't just write and publish. I really, really hope I never get to that point. I think that it would really break my heart if this became just something that was really like, I don't know, mercenary, or just doing it for like money or doing it for recognition. I try really hard to be mindful of this not being a results-oriented process, because frankly, I've held the books in my hand when they get published. I've won a few. I've been very, very fortunate. I've won some awards. I've done things, and it's an amazing feeling, but it also doesn't last. And the thing that does last, and the thing that is more permanent and more life-giving and vibrant and spiritually satisfying, is the process. It's the fact that back to Andrea's question, it's the doing a little bit of it every day and being able to touch the fact, like access every day, the fact that you are able to enter these worlds and that this thing opens up for you. Like that is how I try to remember to be motivated through that.
Okay, great. Great question. So Shireen, you are up next. And while Shireen asks her question, please fill out the one question feedback form that I just put into the chat. It takes literally 20 seconds. Great, Shireen, go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I'm devastated because my daughter is 17 and worships you, and she's in class right now, and so she couldn't be here to ask her own questions.
Oh my God.
But yeah, I'm just happy she got to see the first half hour. Anyway, and she's passed your book to anyone and everyone who has any interest in Palestine and the Middle East, in beautiful writing. Anyway, so I'm speaking on her behalf there.
Oh.
I was just nosy. I wanted to know what was on your necklace because it looks like writing.
So funny.
Yeah, is there writing on there?
Yeah. So first of all, please give your daughter my love and tell her that I say thank you. This is sabr. It just says, it's the Arabic word for patience. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Sabr tayyib. Yeah. My grandmother used to say that all the time. That's beautiful. I also was curious. I feel like we've had a little vista into your creative process. You give yourself half an hour. It sounds to me like you wouldn't have time to really listen to music, but I wondered if you do when you write, and if so, what sort of music helps you or inspires you? Or
I love that question. So because I'm so word oriented, if I listen to music with lyrics, I start paying attention to the lyrics, so I can't do that. But I will sometimes listen to classical music. I can listen to instrumental music while I write, and that really helps. Honestly, usually it's just like classical stuff. I've tried so many times to write, like listening to like a band that I like, and I'm like, no, I just get too distracted. Yeah. I'm all about those words.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank your daughter for me.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so Hala, I have a couple more questions before we log off.
Of course.
What are you working on right now?
So I'm working on a nonfiction. It's my first long form nonfiction. It's kind of like a cultural memoir about the concept of erasure. So it talks about erasure as like a external to internal thing. So the way that it happens to marginalized communities, and then also internalized erasure. So like eating disorders, substance abuse, codependency, like the ways that we erase ourselves essentially.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And like, do you feel like when you finish these two books, are there things that you're like, okay, like for example, if you had another dream about, the 67 war, right? A storyline relating to 67.
Mm-hmm.
Would you feel like, have kind of mined that already? Or would you be like, no, there's so much more? Are you constantly looking to mine other counter narratives as well?
So it's, if I got really inspired and excited about something in 67, yeah, I would do it again. I think there's a novel. So in addition to the nonfiction, there's a novel I'm working on that's based on it's like a woman whose college roommate gets murdered, and it's kind of like thrillery, and she sort of has to, like 10 years later, and she's kind of walking backwards and figuring out what happened. And that was like, I was on Bear Mountain with my partner, with my husband and our friend, and we were just talking about like crime and thriller and how there isn't really like, a lot of times you don't see a person of color and then a white character, and like what would happen if it were reversed. And then I was like, oh my God, I have an idea. I'm really excited. I need to go write this down. So if I get excited about something, I'll commit to it. I'll do it.
Yeah.
I don't like, even if it's been territory I've mined before.
There isn't enough, honestly, there is not enough genre writing, movies, TV, and it's like, I like co-sign that big time.
Yeah, no, totally.
Okay, with that, I just want to say two last things. I put the feedback link in the chat. Please take a second to do that. And if you love what we're doing, we host events every other day. We put everything online. All of this stuff is for free. The reason why it's for free is very intentional. It's because we're trying to have the biggest, broadest, most diverse community possible, which means that we don't want to push anyone away if they can't afford to pay. But if you are able to and you are inspired by our work, please consider supporting it and helping us grow sustainably, where we don't have to rely on governmental institutions, we don't have to rely on commercial interests. We're trying to keep this free, open to all, and not tied to any of that. So if you're interested in supporting us, we're trying to build a global public library for a region that desperately needs public libraries. So please, thank you for your help in doing that. With that, Hala, thank you so much for doing this. You've been a afikra supporter for so many years. This was really fun to be able to dive in your work.
Oh my God, my pleasure. And thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important. I'm so thrilled to be part of it in any way that I can.
Thanks, everybody. And we have another talk on Thursday. And then Saturday, we're taking a break, but then we're back again on Tuesday. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day wherever you are.
And thank you, everyone that came and asked questions. Bye.
Yeah, really fun. Oh, and here you go. This is the book. Again.
Oh yeah, it's my book.
Okay, everybody. Yalla. Enjoy your day or night wherever you are. Bye, guys.
Bye.